All right, Burnsville Psych, we're going to do two parts to Freud today. For class, it is essential that you watch this video on id-ego and superego. I will do part two on some of Freud's basic theories related to psychoanalysis. So, Freud in 10 minutes, id-ego and superego. When we were talking about Sigmund Freud's model of how your mind works, he comes up with three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. What we're going to do is work our way through these parts and talk about what they do and what they're responsible for, and then we can take a quick hint at defense mechanisms and what's coming up with that. All right, so the first picture we have here is a picture of the iceberg, and this is the iceberg metaphor or model for how personality is broken down. Freud says that of these three parts that we have in our mind, only two of them have any connection to our conscious mind. So notice the waterline right here. Above the waterline is what we have access to, what is in our conscious mind. We know that Freud is all about the unconscious being a motivator for how we behave and what our personality is. Therefore, the parts that are below the waterline, that are unconscious, have an influence on our personality and our behavior, but we might not fully understand what is going on down there. So the iceberg is a nice metaphor because we all know that the part of the iceberg we see is only a small part of what actually exists below the water. So we will come back to this picture because once we know what the id is and the superego and ego, the idea that some of this is unconscious is going to be an important piece. So what is the id? Id is the first part. This is the part that we are basically born with. It says here that the id contains our instinctual and biological urges or drives. We've been talking quite a bit about Freud, and we should all be pretty clear right now that when we talk about these urges or drives, and in Freudian theory, we are talking about sex and aggression. So for each of the three parts of Freud's model, we have a certain principle. And in the case of the id, we're talking about the pleasure principle. Basically, according to your id, the goal that you should have is to take care of whatever it is that makes you happy or feel good. Okay, so the pleasure principle, we're operating on what the person wants to do. Not what they should do, not what they could do, not what would be the right thing to do, but what you want to do. So the example that I generally use when we're talking about this is a piece of cake. If you can imagine a big chocolate cake that is 12 inches across, big, delicious looking cake. The id would dive right into the middle of that cake and eat the whole cake because it tastes good. Why stop? Why limit yourself? When we're talking about the ego, it says here, does not work off of the pleasure principle. It works off of the reality principle, what you can actually get away with, what you can do. Not what you want to do, but what you can do. Freud says that the ego comes online sometime between 2 and 3 years old, and this is the rational part of our brain and our personality that tries to satisfy those desires or urges in socially acceptable ways. Okay, so if I see a pretty girl on the side of the road, my id would say, hit her over the head with a stick and drag her back to my cave. My ego knows that I can't do that if I want to live in society because we have rules. So what would be a socially acceptable way to try to connect with a female? Well, I might ask her on a date, something like that. Okay, so the ego, reality principle, rational. The last part that Freud talks about is the superego, and this is the last to develop, forms during early childhood. And if you think back to Kohlberg's theory on moral reasoning, he's probably fairly right. The idea that working off of the moral principle, what we should do, not what we can or what we want to do, but what we should do, Freud says probably early childhood. Think 6 or 7. That's probably about when Kohlberg said that some of your moral reasoning comes online. So if you can imagine that feeling of that kind of nagging voice in your mind, scolding you for doing the thing that's wrong. Um, some people call that your conscience. Some people call it, morality. Some people call it ethics. All of that in Freudian language would be the superego. So if we go back a couple of pages and we look at this iceberg again, notice that only part of what we have access to, um, part of our mind is above the waterline. Some of that is our ego and some of that is our superego. Notice down here that the id, that pleasure principle, that is those urges, that this is all the sex and aggression, according to Freud, is completely unconscious. So what that means is that it is influencing our behavior, but we might not necessarily recognize the lengths that the id is going to push us. Superego has some conscious and some unconscious, same with the ego. What we're getting at is the idea that, let me go to this picture, that there is this conflict that develops, and it's basically, on the one hand, we have our superego telling us what we should do. On the other hand, we have the id telling us what we want to do, what would be fun or nice or feel good. And then the ego's job in the middle is to try to deal with the balancing act, to try to make it so that you are meeting your needs in ways that we can deal with in society. 6 minutes, perfect. So this creates a lot of conflict, and frankly, sometimes we are bothered because we have, the devil on the one shoulder telling us what we should do, and we have the angel on the other shoulder telling us what we should do, and we're bogged down. So Freud says that to take care of that, we have these defense mechanisms that we use to, it says, help the ego reduce anxiety through self-deception. I think self-deception is kind of the key piece here. We lie to ourselves to reduce anxiety. Once you see the list and once I start explaining what these are, you'll be like, oh, yeah, I've been doing these for years. Notice that it says these happen at unconscious levels. So defense mechanisms are largely unconscious. If they were conscious, they would not work because we know we're lying to ourselves. So the first one, rationalization. We all rationalize all the time. Basically says we make up an excuse for behaviors that cause us anxiety. If I am at school and I fail a test, what are some of the excuses that I can come up with that will reduce my anxiety and make me feel better? Well, the teacher didn't teach it right. Or I had 7 tests that day. Or it's so cold the ink wouldn't work and I couldn't study. Or there's 8 million kinds of excuses that would be acceptable that would take the burden off of me and put it somewhere else so that I don't have to feel bad about the poor test score. That's rationalization. Repression. The idea of repression is that we take those painful thoughts or unacceptable thoughts and we just shove them down into our unconscious mind so that we don't have to think about them. This, by the way, is how Freud says that the Oedipus complex is not something that we remember. The idea that we were in love with our opposite sex parents, the Oedipus or Electra complex, that's something that we all think is the craziest idea ever because Freud says we've repressed those memories. We've shoved them down deep. If something bad happens to me and I push it away so I don't have to think about it, that is repression. Denial is an easy one that we do, again, I think fairly regularly. Basically, we refuse to accept the reality that something that causes us anxiety exists. So if I am failing in a class and I won't look at my grades and I just will go along like everything's fine and I'm doing well. If my bank account is empty and I am getting calls from the bill collector, then I will not answer the phone and go to a movie instead because then I don't have to think about it. I can just deny that it's even happening at all. Projection is the next one. Projection is kind of fun. Projection is the idea that I will unconsciously, again, transfer unacceptable traits from me onto other people. So if I feel like deep down I'm kind of a lazy person, the thing that I'm going to most notice in other people is what? their laziness. So I might actually comment on how all these kids these days, they don't know how to work hard, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that is projection. If you think about what a projector is, it takes that light and it shoots it out onto the wall. Okay, we're projecting away from ourselves onto someone else. The next one, reaction formation, is kind of the opposite of projection. In this case, I'm taking those feelings or those traits that I have within me, and instead of projecting it onto someone else, I replace it with its opposite. That's reaction formation. So if I feel inside that I am kind of weak and not manly, what am I going to do in public? I am going to make sure I let everybody know not only am I not weak, but I'm a big tough guy. So I will in fact go around acting all macho and perhaps getting in fights to show other people that it's not true. Reaction formation, if you can think of like the little man syndrome, that's kind of reaction formation in a nutshell. A couple more. Regression is the idea that we go back to an earlier and less mature pattern of behavior. So if I am 3 years old and I'm sucking my thumb to help calm myself down and soothe anxiety, if I'm 13 years old, generally sucking your thumb is seen as kind of peculiar and childish and weird. If I start all of a sudden sucking my thumb because my parents are going through a divorce, that would be a clear case of regression. If I go off to college and I'm nervous because I'm away from home for the first time and I start sleeping with my blankie again, that would be regression. We're going back to something that made sense when we were younger but is not right for where we're at. The last two we have displacement and sublimation. I'll actually put them both up. Displacement and sublimation are related. They're both actually kind of versions of displacement, but sublimation is its own specific type. Displacement is I'm taking a feeling from its true source and I'm transferring it to something else that is more safe or more socially acceptable. Perfect case is if you have siblings and one of them gets yelled at by a parent. They have been trained that you're not supposed to yell back at your parents. You can't fight with your mom or dad because that would be, wrong and rude. So I can't bring that feeling of anger and deliver it to my mom. So I'm going to take that feeling and transfer it over to another target that is safer or more socially acceptable. So who can I be mad at? I can be mad at the dog or my little brother or sister, or I can punch the wall or do something like that, some inanimate object. All of those things would be safe and socially acceptable. Sublimation is a kind of displacement, and the difference here is that the kind of feeling that we're generally talking about is, again, redirected from something that is maybe not the true source, but more socially accepted. Generally here, the feeling is more along the lines of sex. So when we talk about sublimation, generally the way people talk about it is uh, uh, a young kid has sexual feelings. They don't know how to deal with those feelings, or the target isn't possible. So they will channel that energy, redirect that energy into something that's socially accepted. So I will try out for the track team and then run and run and run, okay, like a fiend. I'll be the best athlete on the team. Those are the defense mechanisms in a nutshell. In class, we will go through some examples and see how these work and do more of that work. That's it for today. If you have a minute and you want a refresher on Freud's basic ideas of psychoanalysis, you should definitely check that out. It's Freud Part 2. Good night.